Yeah, we will. Just before we do, I would like to just address one of the things that caller brought up. He mentioned Ralph Rene, doubted the theory of relativity. What I should just like to point out is that all Rene was had beef with relativity about. All he thought was that the experiments that they used to, test the theory were too sloppy. That was his only beef with it.
Understood.
So just point that out before we start.
I've seen some Ralph Rene stuff, and I know that he talks a little rough sometimes, and sometimes that can throw people off. But either way, we're talking to Jarrah White tonight.
Okay. So, now, you wanted to know about the Van Allen radiation belts. That's
one
of the main reasons why they couldn't go.
There's specific, scientific, technical reasons why moon hoax folks, and these people are not dummies people, a lot of them are highly trained individuals, scientists and such, that believe that it's not physically possible. That's why we haven't done it again, and that's why no one goes above a certain altitude. That's what I wanted to get into.
Okay, cool. Well, the main reason why we can't go higher than a certain altitude is because of the radiation in space. Now, in the beginning, James Van Allen, the guy who discovered the radiation belts, he had been putting Geiger counters in these little machines called raccoons. Now, a raccoon is basically a rocket, right, with the instrument package inside, and it's attached to a weather balloon. The balloon goes up high into the atmosphere, then the rocket fires the rest of the way up. He was getting into outer space using these machines, and they all detected high levels of radiation. Later on, he would get to put these instruments inside satellites, such as the Explorer 1. Now, every time they descend to about 1,000 kilometers, I believe that's 600 miles in, so as soon as he reached 1,000 kilometers, he's always received these enormous levels of radiation. They'd suddenly start to count excessively high, and suddenly the machine would just die on him because there was too much radiation for it to cope with.
Right.
The same thing would happen with all the other subsequent satellites, and then finally he decided, well, why don't we put this Geiger counter inside a lead shield, so it will continue to count where these guys seem to fail. So he did that with the Explorer 4, right? He did it again on the Pioneer probes that followed, and every time they went up there, right, it was eventually established that the readings were 10 to 100 rem per hour with this lead shield on. Now, we use rem to measure how much radiation a person is absorbing, right? Now, to kill a person, you need to absorb about 500 rem, but even a dose in excess of 100 rem is going to be causing problems, like the various radiation symptoms such as vomiting, fatigue, and low blood counts, all that sort of stuff, right? Anyways, with this lead shield, the readings were 10 to 100 rem per hour, right? Without the lead shield, the readings were anywhere from 312.5 rem per hour to 11,666 rem per hour, right? Now, nothing, he specifically stated you can go to the library and find these magazines by James Van Allen. One of them is the March 1959 issue of Scientific American, okay? The article is titled Radiation Belts Around the Earth. The other article was featured in Space World in December 1961. That article was appropriately called The Danger Zone. Right? He specifically said that effectively shielding the astronauts is beyond engineering capabilities in the near future. In fact, there's no way they can engineer a rocket powerful enough to lift the required shielding. An astrophysicist by the name of John H. Malden, he wrote the book Prospects for Interstellar Travel. He writes about books, about traveling from Earth to the other planets and then the other stars, right? And he specifically says that at the distance of the Earth, right, the solar flares you get are anywhere from hundreds to thousands of rem, and you have to shield these astronauts using 2 meters of water shielding. You see, you put the capsule inside this gigantic tank of water. The water effectively absorbs all the radiation. You see, when the particles collide with the spacecraft wall, they actually shatter into a dangerous spray of secondary particles. Like neutrons and also rays like X-rays and gamma rays, that sort of stuff. And basically, you need a whole lot of water to absorb this secondary particle fragmentation and everything else. Okay, and in fact, the aluminium that they used on Apollo, that would have made the situation even worse because aluminium increases the risk of particle fragmentation. In fact, when they used it on the International Space Station, even though you're below the Van Allen belts in Earth orbit, okay, you've still got various minor cosmic rays, have managed to get down this far. Okay?
Sure.
Now, normally in space, aboard the shuttle or aboard the space station, right, the doses are about 0.027 rem per day, right? With this aluminium shielding on the ISS, the International Space Station, the reading shot up to 0.1 rem per day. This is 3.7 times greater than normal. Okay, now suppose you were traveling with the shielding through radiation where it's at a minimum of 312.5 rem per hour. Think of how much radiation you'll get then with all this aluminium on you.
Right. So,
yeah.
I mean, basically, when you talk about this, and Van Allen, I have to ask you, when he passed away, did he have thoughts about? Did he make statements about his thoughts regarding the moon landings, or was it?
Well, when he subsequent to the release of the Fox special, he later said, "Oh, I must have made a mistake." Well, how do you make a mistake, for God's sake? You've got all these Geiger counters, right, that got fried by this radiation, right? And even today, right, when satellites have to go into the Van Allen radiation belts, they always have to have their instruments shut off. You know, you have to have your instruments switched off. Like the Hubble goes through this this tiny region called the South Atlantic Anomaly. You know, it's not as harmful as the rest of the belts, but every time it goes in there, it has to be switched off, because otherwise it will get fried by the radiation.
And the gentleman, everyone who's come back, supposedly, we're talking about the folks, especially from Apollo 11, let's say. None of them
Neil Armstrong.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz and who was the other gentleman?
Michael Collins.
Thank you. None of these gentlemen have radiation problems since their flight. Have they? Have they had any sort of cancers?
None of them have. No, they're all alive and kicking. You know, at that exposure, they all should have died in space. You know, because like it's not just the Van Allen radiation belts. Okay, you've also got the solar flares. Right now, the solar flares are these bursts of hot gas from the sun. They spray all this enormous levels of radiation out into space. You know, like protons and electrons and X-rays and gamma rays. All this stuff. It flies out into space. Right now, during the 60s, right, there's a book called Astronautical Engineering and Science. It's written by various scientists at the Marshall Space Flight Center. They specifically stated that even the minor solar flares could deliver 25 rem per hour, right, depending on how many centimeters of water shielding that you used. Okay.
Wow.
And then, of course, there's also that's just the minor flares. Okay. You've also got major ones. In fact, if you check the NOAA's comprehensive flare index for major flares, you know, this is like a list of all the major flares that have happened in history, right? You'll find that at least out of all the in total, there was about 14,000 flares during all the Apollo missions combined, right? It turns out that 30 of them were major flares, which can deliver in excess of 100 rem per hour. And in fact, some of these flares were even greater than the major flares of August 1972. And those flares were considered to be the Godzillas of all solar flares. You know, astronomers, they make no secret of the fact that those flares in August could have killed an astronaut if he was out there at the time, right? Some of these Apollo flares were even greater than those.
It sounds so, like I said, when you look at, we're talking now 40 years ago, people, and if you believe NASA and you believe a lot of, you know, conservative folks, traditionalists, they're saying, yeah, we went to the moon 40 years ago, okay, we didn't go, we haven't gone since, and we haven't gone to that part of space since, because we just didn't want to. And we have no interest because it's just a dead rock, I imagine. I don't seem to get a good answer to that question. I don't know if you have. But what this Van Allen belt, before we let go of it, where does it stand today? Are there mainstream science people that just stand by the fact that this is just BS?
Nowadays, they just claim, oh, yes, the Van Allen belts are lethal, but the astronauts weren't in it that long. They just crossed it very briefly. Well, that's just plain wrong, okay? To go to the moon, right, when you're on your way to the moon, you spend 1 hour in the Van Allen belt, 1 hour going to the moon, and another hour coming back on the return trip, right? Now, in the beginning, James Van Allen explicitly stated that even a rapid transit through the radiation belts would be hazardous, okay? And obviously it was going to be hazardous when you think about it at the dose rate of, 312.5 rem per hour to 11,666 rem per hour. Obviously, that's going to be doing a whole heap of damage in just 1 hour.
And let's go back to the caller who claims that the Russians were, if he knows his history, and I am glad you called, the Russians were very sophisticated and were beating us. They were beating us in the space race. They did not go to the moon, and one of the major reasons, I'm guessing, was probably because of radiation exposure. Am I right?
That's correct. In fact, in the 1963, you've heard of the British scientist Sir Bernard Lovell from Dodgeville Bank, Manchester University. Anyways, in 1963, he went to the Soviet Union. He was shown everything, like all the exhibits, all the machines, all the equipment they were using, and that sort of stuff. And Russia explicitly told him that, hey, we can see no ways of protecting cosmonauts. See, they call their astronauts cosmonauts. We can see no way of protecting cosmonauts from the lethal effects of solar radiation, and thus we don't plan on going to the moon. Right? Go tell NASA. We can't shield our astronauts. Go warn NASA. The reason this is important is because not only did the Soviet Union, not only did they have all these major firsts in space, right? They also had these immensely powerful rockets. You see, what they had, the Soviet spacecraft, such as the Vostok, the Voskhod, and the Soyuz, they all use a sea level cabin pressure, like the air pressure we're sitting in right now, right? Now, to launch a cabin with that kind of air pressure, you need very thick walls on the spacecraft, and subsequently you need a very powerful rocket to lift it up. Now, the Americans, they were reduced to using lightweight capsules that could only contain a low-pressure single-gas atmosphere, 3 or 5 psi pure oxygen, right? Whereas the Russians, they were able to lift a sea-level pressure of nitrogen and oxygen. Okay. Now, if these guys, the Russians, couldn't protect their cosmonauts with their immensely thicker walls than what NASA was using, well, how do you expect NASA to do any better?
No, exactly. That's my whole point. And in fact, even today, 40 years later, folks, if someone, a privateer who wants to shell out, I don't know how much they're charging these days, but they'll go over to Russia if they want to get a free ride on a spacecraft into orbit, because not only they're offering it to anybody, but to be honest with you, it's probably a lot more sturdy still to this day, even their technology. We've screwed it up plenty, and 40 years, if everyone there is thinking that our technology since the 60s hasn't really progressed enough, that we couldn't go back to the moon and use it, like we said, just from the start, use it as a launch pad in zero-G to go to Mars would be the obvious reason to be on the lunar surface and have bases and such. I know, Jarrah, you can talk to us a little bit about this. They had plans, supposedly. I'd seen schematics for lunar bases that would have been built. Did you see some of these?
Yeah, that's correct. In the beginning, in the 1960s, they had planned, okay, after the moon landing, we'll build a base on the moon, then we'll go to Mars and the other planets, etc. They were even planning on doing a flyby around Venus, right? Now, what they need, but of course, they just needed to, meet Kennedy's promise of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, for propaganda reasons, okay? Okay, Apollo 11, okay, we've landed now. Now, how are we going to get out of this? Okay, we've completed the military objective. Now, how do we get out of this? Okay, right. They had Apollo 13, which was this near disaster, allegedly, where they supposedly have an oxygen tank explosion, right? And that mission subsequently resulted in the cancellation of the Apollo program and the mission to Mars, the missions past Venus, etc., etc. And basically, that's how it went. That's basically their way of getting out of, to limit the amount of fakery they'd have to do. In fact, on the missions that they did have left, they found one way or another to degrade or lose the footage that they had, such as on Apollo 11, you might remember they had the grainy black and white TV footage, which is now lost, by the way, right? On Apollo 12, this was the first mission to bring a color camera there. We pointed the camera to the sun and burnt out the Videocon tube. And on Apollo 13, the near disaster, we have to cancel the TV footage, to save power. And on Apollo 14, they did bring the camera there. The surface is overexposed, can't really see much. And then they had the later missions with the rovers. Well, that was better, but they were still filming it off the TV screens, which would degrade the footage. TV signals there are actually filmed off TV screens first.